Environment. I'm Malvika, and I have the pleasure and privilege of being your MC today for a conversation between Jason Rosenfeld and Njideka Akunyili Crosby. A few quick notes before we get started. The Brooklyn Rail stands in complete solidarity with the uprising unfolding across the country following the murders of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, Tony McDade, Nina Pop, Jamel Floyd, and generations of structural violence against Black communities. Black Lives Matter, and we will continue to support those fighting for this truth. Please join us now for a moment of silence. We'll be recording this gathering for the Rail archives. If you would prefer not to be seen, you can easily disable your camera by pressing the stop video button on the bottom left corner of your screen. Feel free to eat your lunch during this event. No worries about interfering sounds, as we'll keep the audience on mute until about question time towards the end of the conversation. If you do have questions, please write them in the chat and I will call on you to speak during the Q&A. Or alternatively, I'm also happy to read your question on your behalf if you have connectivity issues. Feel free to introduce yourself and shout out where you're from in the chat. The Rail team will be helping out with tech if you have any questions, and our production assistants, Miko, Claudio, as well as our managing editor, Charlie, will be typing closed captions today to make this talk more accessible. So please feel free to turn those on at the bottom of your screen. And today we have an extra special treat. Before we all depart, the poet Ed Stark is here with us today, and and we'll be reading a poem today. And now to introduce today's host. Today we have Jason Rosenfeld, PhD, who is also a distinguished chair and professor of art history at Marymount Manhattan College. He was co-curator of the exhibition John Everett Millais at Tate Britain, Van Gogh Museum, Pre-Raphaelites, Victorian and Avant-Garde at the Tate Britain and the National Gallery of Art in DC, and River Crossings. He has contributed to the lead text for a Phaedon monograph on Cecily Brown that will be published later this year. And he is curating an exhibition on Andy Goldsworthy for the Yale Center for British Art 2024. Very exciting. He's senior writer and editor at large with us here at the Jason, take it away.
Hi, thank you very much for that introduction. Welcome everybody to Thursday Zoom with the new social environment, Brooklyn Rail. I believe this is number 63 as we're puffing along strong. Just a few thanks before we get into it with Njideka. Thank you to Malvika and Sophia and everybody, Nick, Catherine, Jeremy, JC, Charlie, Madeline, etc. And of course, Fong at the Brooklyn Rail, who make all of this possible. I want to thank Hannah Schoenk at David Zwerner Gallery, who works with Njideka. I want to also thank the Victoria Miro Gallery in London, as well as Eileen Painter-Kim from the studio in LA, who's been helping us out with images and stuff, and also Ed Steck, who you will hear from later today in terms of poetry. It is a pleasure to welcome Njideka Akunyili Crosby to the show today, and to talk to her about her work and her life and her fantastic contributions to art in our moment in time, in this difficult moment in time. So I want to thank everyone for hanging out with us, and we'll see where we go with this. Just to introduce our artist today, she was born in Enugu, is that right? Nigeria, in 1983, and she moved to Lagos for boarding school when she was young, and lived there until she was 17 or 18, and then moved to the US, and she did her degree, bachelor's of arts, after taking some college at some courses at Philadelphia Community College. She did a BA with honors at Swarthmore College, home of the Garnet, in Swarthmore, Pennsylvania. She did a degree in biology and also art. And then she did a post-baccalaureate certificate at PAFA, the Pennsylvania Academy of Fine Arts in Philadelphia, the oldest art institution for learning and teaching in America. And then that was in 2006. She finished up. 2011, she did her MFA at a small and slightly only little known college in New Haven called Yale University, where she finished up in 2011. And she has moved to Los Angeles and has been wowing everybody ever since. So we're really happy to have you here today to talk about your work and to talk about your life and your career, etc. Let's see. So I'm going to just go to the screen and share with you a little presentation that we put together. And say, good morning, Njideka. How are you?
Good morning, Jason, I'm well. Can you hear me?
We can hear you. The whole world is listening.
I actually realized after we had done all the mic demo that I was using the computer speaker, not my microphones, but I fixed it.
Okay. Good.
Thank you so much for that introduction. I wanted to thank Fong for this invitation, to thank Malvika for helping me navigate this tech, and the rest of the Brooklyn Rail team, as well as my incredible studio manager, Eileen Painter-Kim. I want to thank all those at home who are joining to listen to this discussion, and most especially also thank you, Jason, for doing this discussion with me.
Pleasure, pleasure. So maybe give a short potted history of your life before you moved to the United States, and your connection with art, if any, in Nigeria until you got here, before you got here.
When I was, you already mentioned I grew up in Enugu. I left when I was about 10 to go to Lagos to boarding school. And actually I left Lagos when I was 16 to move to the United States. So growing up, I did a lot of drawing. I'll find a piece of charcoal from outside wherever, and I'll make copies of photographs I saw in magazines. My dad bought Time magazine and Newsweek religiously, and I'll do drawings from them. So that was the extent of what I did for art, what I did regarding art. And we lived in Enugu, which is just about an hour from Nsukka, which has a very rich history of Nigerian art. It's where the Nsukka school was based. Elana Tsui lives there. And I'm ashamed to say my family had no connection to that. I didn't even know it existed till years after I left. I just want to be careful that I don't make it sound like there wasn't phenomenal art happening in Nigeria. My family was connected from it because we were a very science-heavy family.
Your mother taught at university?
Yes, she was a she was a faculty member in the Department of Pharmacology and Therapeutics, and my dad worked at the University of Nigeria Teaching Hospital in Enugu, Nigeria. So then when I went to Lagos, to Queen's College, I started taking drawing classes. And that was the first time I remember the school going for excursions to art museums. There were a few small like collectors who opened up their houses like museums. I think there was one called the Dicke that we had gone to. So that's when I really knew this was something I was interested in. But I didn't take my first oil painting class was at the Community College of Philadelphia when I moved to the United States.
Now, let me ask you about that because, as you know, I'm a historian of British art. And I was interested because, of course, Nigeria was part of the Commonwealth until 1960 when it got independence. You've said in interviews, written about how your mother arranged for you, as I understand it, to get a green card through the green card lottery to come to the United States. Was there ever a thought of going to London instead of the US?
No, which is a little bit surprising because Nigeria's connection is with the United Kingdom, because we used to be a colony up until we became independent in 1960. So that's where a lot of Nigerians go. That's where a lot of Nigerians have deep connections, because for a long time, if you were born in London, or if you were born in the UK, you were a citizen, and they stopped it in 1989, I believe, because, you know, God forbid too many Black and brown people become citizens, which of course we're seeing that same rhetoric here. So there were lots of Nigerians who were British citizens because they were born there and they went to the UK for school. My mother wanted us to come to the United States because the education system in Nigeria is very similar to the education system in the United Kingdom, which makes you pretty much choose your path in life when you're in senior secondary 1. It's called SS1. And at that point, you're about 13 or 14 years old. You have to decide if you're going to be in the sciences or not. And then if you're in the sciences, you actually take an exam to enter college to study something. You're admitted to study something specific. Unlike the American system where you enter and you don't know what you're doing for years and you experiment and take lots
forever.
And then make up your mind. And I think my mom really liked that system. So she applied for the green card lottery, which of course we've heard the person who lives in the White House right now say very disparaging things about it and how they're sending over the worst they have to give. It's absolutely not true. The country doesn't pick the people who apply, people self-select to apply. So my mother applied for the green card lottery and she got it. And if you get it, all your children get it. So we all got the legal right to live in the United States. And that's how I ended up coming here.
So did you all move over here then?
No, because we were not 18 yet. There were 6 kids and only 1 kid was 18 when we got it. So the plan was you stayed in Nigeria till you finished high school and then you came over.
Okay, I see. And then why did they pick Philadelphia? Now, just to let you know, I grew up just north of Philadelphia, 20 miles north of Philadelphia. So that's my home city, essentially, although I've been a New Yorker forever. But why Philadelphia?
I had skipped the 6th grade. So I have a sister that is a little over a year older than me. So because I skipped the 6th grade, I ended up being in the same class with her. So we came over to the United States together. I think I was 16 and she was 17 plus. And we moved to Philadelphia because the eldest in the family, my sister, was going to Penn. So we lived a few blocks away from her. So we had some kind of adult presence who made sure we were fine and safe.
Okay, I see. And then you took classes in the Philadelphia Community College, and there was a faculty member there who directed you to Swarthmore?
Yes. Yes, I had taken a painting class with an incredible artist called Jeff Reed. And this one day after class, he asked my sister and I to stay back because at this point we were studying for the SATs. We were looking at different, Jason?
Yeah.
Oh, yeah, we were looking at different, sorry, I lost you as my view.
Yeah, it's okay. You're good. Everyone can see you.
Okay, now you're back. I like feeling like I'm talking to one person.
Yeah.
So where was I?
So the reason why you went to Swarthmore to study.
Oh yeah, so he asked us to stay back and he told us like, oh, I know you're looking at different schools. Just based off of working with you for a semester, I think you really will like this small school called Swarthmore College. That was the first time I had ever heard of it. Because at that point I was just looking at Johns Hopkins because I thought, I want to be a doctor. This is the place to go. And I was looking at Penn because my sister went there, and Penn State because my brother was there. So I went to visit, and he had told me that his best friend was the head of the art department. So I went to visit and I walked to the art department. I hadn't emailed or called or made an appointment or anything. So I walked over there, I knocked on his friend's door, Randall Exxon, and he was at his office. And I went inside and we ended up talking for over an hour. And I honestly can say I ended up going to Swarthmore because of him, because I like environments that nurture their students, that show they care for their students. And I got that feeling when I visited, that feeling of if I'm just a prospective student and he could spend so much time with me, imagine if I came here. And So I ended up going, and Randall Exxon ended up being my mentor, and we're still very good friends and in touch. And it was actually integral in my decision to become an artist.
Well, I have to say, as someone who teaches at a small college in Manhattan and who has classes of always less than 20, I think there's a great value to these little schools, which, by the way, are in deep trouble in this country right now because of the situation. We're all sort of struggling, but the kind of experience that you have is, exactly what so many of us are trying to provide. So Randall Exxon is a really interesting artist. I encourage everyone to have a look at his stuff. It's a kind of post-Akins, post-Wyeth, George Stubbsian realism, which is also surreal at the same time. My mentor, Robert Rosenblum, would have loved it. It, of course, has nothing visually that I can tell that relates to what you do. But that's, as a teacher, you don't want to just make people who do what you do.
Exactly, yes.
And I'm sure that's something that you brought into your teaching practice.
Yes.
So when you went to Yale, tell us a little bit about what Yale was like in the I know I was going to put you on the spot because I've asked everybody this. I asked Matt B. Levenstein about this. And, what was Yale like to be a student there in that period?
The big exhale.
The late 2000s.
It's always tough for me to talk about Yale. And for a long time after I graduated, I actually made a conscious decision to not talk about graduate school because I went to, once you start talking about something and you realize the anger is still there from your experience, but hopefully maybe enough time has passed, I think. Yale is complicated to talk about because it's a mixed bag in that my experience there was invaluable to my work. I learned so much. My work grew so much. It changed so much. And I got to work with some phenomenal people. Like so much of the work I do now is really underpinned by printmaking. I mean, you can see like all the stencil taping stuff going on in the back. And that really started with this incredible class I took with Rochelle Feinstein when I was there. There's a phenomenal painter, Catherine Murphy. I got to work with her. She was a joy. She was, once again, I love learning environments that are loving and nurturing. She was those things.
I actually reviewed her last show at Peter Freeman. She's amazing. She's fantastic. Fabulous.
Incredible. Nicola Y was amazing. So I got to work with, and also going to a program like Yale where you have access to classes outside the School of Art. I got to, for instance, study with Hazel Carby. I took a African and Caribbean diaspora literature class, which was a game changer for my practice and my work and the way I was able to talk about and think about what I was trying to do. So there was just like all that incredible stuff that I'll always be grateful for. But there was also, there was a lot of other stuff. I didn't feel as nurtured as I was used to, or as I would have liked to be. And my second year was better, and this is one of those things, like sometimes you're only able to make sense of things after you graduate and look back. But at the end of my first year, looking back now, that probably was, I'm just like, I will not get emotional. But that probably was one of the most depressing year of my life was my first year in grad school.
But it's sort of part of the thing, right? They don't want to hold you by the hand. They don't even teach you technique necessarily.
It's not. I feel like I do agree with that. Like, yes, you should be critical and stuff, but there is, I think for me, when you're in those kind of situations, you keep telling yourself, maybe this is okay. Maybe this is how you teach. Maybe this is how you get someone to learn. And I think what really made it clear that it wasn't was after Yale, I went straight to the Studio Museum program. I went to do a residency at the Studio Museum, and being at the Studio Museum and just having this feeling of this is what it feels like to be supported and loved by an institution. And yeah, so Yale was, was really tough. And I keep thinking of the sociologist, Dr. Tracy McMillan Cottom, who talked about how every year there are always Black students, especially Black women, crying in her office, Black graduate students. And she said that the advice she gives them, and she wishes to send this out to everyone, is sometimes these institutions do not know how to love us. And you almost just have to take what you can out of it and leave as quickly as you can with your sanity intact. So it was just really tough to be in a place where that made me question myself, that made me wonder if, I mean, like I remember sitting in my studio second semester, first year, and just thinking, maybe I've made a mistake and I should just quit this thing and go to med school. And I just couldn't believe, like, oh my God, they're about to break me down and make me do stuff my Nigerian parents could not get me to do after a year trying. And I mean, Nigerian parents I don't think there's anything they love as much as medicine. So they worked on me for a year. And I was just like, nope, art is my thing. And then after a year, I was like, maybe I made a mistake. So it was just like feeling like nobody knew what I was trying to do. And I think that's why Hazel Carby's class was so important, because that was the first time I felt I wasn't alone. And what I was trying to do was valid. What I was trying to say was important. Making work that affirmed my existence mattered. Yeah. And I just felt for a lot of my first year was a lot of, we don't know what you're trying to do. And it wasn't just random thoughts. It was also like through official channels. I got a letter my first semester. I was on academic warning that they did not know what I was doing. And the second semester, I was put on academic probation because I wasn't working, which was ridiculous. I mean, of course, this was years before I even knew the term like racial microaggression, which microaggression is a wrong term to use because there's nothing micro about it when you're in the middle of it. It's very soul crushing. Anyway, I don't want to, I feel like I'm like going back to an angry, frustrated, sad place, but it was a very mixed bag.
Yeah, it sounds like, thank you for sharing that with us. And it does sound like, you know, there's an argument for not going into a conservatory program, for going into a broader situation with the liberal arts program where you could take a course like that, one that you did in literary theory and in writing that sort of, you know, maybe gave you a kind of freedom to do what you then emerged doing, you know, straight away.
Exactly. And I also want to say, I don't think this is something that is unique to Yale, because what has been most shocking to me, which is why what Dr. Tracy McMillan Cotton said resonated so much with me. What has been so shocking for me is that since I graduated, like when I go to schools and I talk to other students, to see how many people of color have these kind of experiences in graduate programs, not just even in art, in various creative fields. Jeremy O. Harris just did a tweet thread about this week, about how horrible his time at the Yale School of Drama was, and just having these clashes and not feeling supported. So it's everywhere. I mean, I remember being at Skidmore and talking to two Black women who came to see the show, and they were talking about their grad school experience, and it was like a mirror of mine down to, you know, they were talking about this experience they had in this one class where, you know, it's like where you say something and your teacher ignores you, and then someone else says the same thing, someone who is probably a white man, and the teacher affirms what they say, or like, oh yeah, that's good, and you continue the discussion. And it happens often enough that you actually just end up shutting up in class.
Right.
And you know, when you just have that light bulb, like, oh my God, that happened to me. And at the end of class, you just go in and you sit down and you say nothing, because in your mind, you just think, well, they're acting, this teacher is acting like I have nothing to say. Like everything I say is garbage. I'll just sit down. And it was just so frustrating for me to realize, my God, I let him shut me up. So the point I'm making is that it's not just Yale. It's
right. Of course not. I
think that's why, you know, a lot of institutions have been putting affirmative, have been putting statements out about how they support the movement happening right now and Black Lives Matter. And I love that people are calling them out, because you really have to examine your institution and the way you act towards the students of color you bring in. And if you're going to say that truth, that Black Lives Matter, if you're going to make that affirmation, you actually have to be a place that proves it. I don't know if I'm explaining this well.
Yeah, no, I think you're totally right. And, you know, I'm it's something that every university, college, place of institution needs to be thinking about all the time. And, you know, faculty that don't have empathy, I don't understand it. I don't know where that comes from. And I'm sure, you know, and faculty who are not inclusive, and your point is that you're there to teach, right? That's the whole thing. It's amazing, no matter who you're teaching. So I expect that you are a great teacher, and you have been teaching now at California Institute of the Arts and at UCLA. So can you talk a little bit about, you know, the way that you've translated your experience into superb teaching over the last few years?
Thanks for that question. I also wanted to point out that it's not just about Black people, it's also people of color, LGBTQ, non-binary people, trans, people with disabilities. And this is why people push for diversity in faculty. And also, like, it's also time for certain people to go. Like, if you cannot broaden your worldview, you should not be teaching in certain institutions. And so I think I love to teach, because I think teaching is also a learning experience. I think sometimes you mentioned earlier on that it's good when a teacher doesn't make you work like them. And I think that's very important. Some of the best teachers I've had are people who kind of push the best, who make the best in you blossom, as opposed to like fostering their way of working on you. And so that's something, it's rare. You don't really see it, come across it a lot. And the times I have, it's been so meaningful that it's made me want to teach. So I love teaching. I try to teach. It's hard for me to get time to teach because my work is very slow and time intensive. And now I have 2 kids, one that is 1 year old. So I try to find ways to make sure I teach. So either teaching 1 semester and then taking a year or a year and a half off, and then teaching and then taking a year and a half off. And, you know, like, people forget that teaching is a collaborative thing. I actually feel like I learn the most semesters when I teach, because you're talking to people from different walks of life. They bring viewpoints to what you're saying that you haven't thought of. I think the problem is so many people teach with ego, like, how dare you question what I'm saying? And if you let that go, you really can grow and have moments of, oh, I hadn't thought about this. And instead of thinking it as challenging what you're saying, it actually expands what you're saying and what you know. And then you go back and you read the book they recommended for you, and your knowledge grows and expands. I love it.
It's true. You should grow every day when you teach. I feel that all the time. I learn so much from my students, not just because I'm getting older and I can no longer relate to them like I used to, but just, you know, in terms of their experiences. And it's the most rewarding thing, I have to say, just above going to see art. So should we look at some of your art?
Yes.
Let's do it. Thank you so much for sharing all that. It's really great, important for people to hear about these experiences and, you know, everything that makes you who you are. So I just wanted to start with this painting, Mama, Mummy, and Mama, Predecessors #2, which is from 2014. It's part of a series of works that you call Predecessors, and which are about your family, as is so much of your work. But and I wanted to talk about it a little bit in the context of its role subsequently as a work that you have used in public art installations. Many of the people listening in or watching today will hopefully recognize this view from the very southern end of the High Line in Manhattan, right next to the Whitney Museum of Art, which would be on your right from this viewpoint, and looking across to one of the old buildings. And actually this rectangular area where the mural is installed is covering the gap where the train tracks, the elevated train tracks, would have continued into this old warehouse and through the building and further downtown along this street, which is Washington Street. So just to launch a sort of discussion about your work and your process, and just, you know, whatever you want to talk about with this.
So with this piece, I had gone to Nigeria in, I think it was December 2012, and I went back to my grandmother's house. So when I was young, my dad grew up in the village with his mother, and then he ended up moving to the town, Enugu. I was born in Enugu, but I used to spend some summers and weekends in the village with my grandmother. And then, you know, I already talked about how I moved to Lagos. So I feel like there are parts of my who I am that were formed in Enugu. There are parts that were formed through this experience of going to the village, and there are parts that are formed through my living in America and being an American citizen now. And in the works, I'm really trying to explore kind of navigate all those. So with this, I wanted to pull some of those together. And the title is Mama is what we call my grandmother. Mommy is my mom. And her picture is in the, I don't know if I have arrow access. Is the
I'll do it for you.
Yeah, the black and white one in the background. And Mama is what we call my little sister, who is in the pink shirt. So when I went to Nigeria in 2012, I went to the village and asked them to open up my grandmother's house. She had been dead for some years, but her living room table was still laid out as it had been when she died. And it had all these objects on top of it. So I took a lot of pictures and I made the series predecessors from those pictures. So a lot of my work talks about generations, my grandparents' generation, my parents' generation, my generation, and kind of like the shifts that have happened in those cultural, psychological in Nigeria. And hopefully we'll talk about that as the discussion keeps going. And so with this, the table becomes a stand-in for my grandmother. And then of course, my sister is a stand-in for my generation, and my parents' generation is represented by my mom in the background. And I do a lot of winks to artists I like, be they visual artists or writers or musicians, either through the work itself, the composition. Sometimes it's through the title, sometimes it's through the thematic pictures I transfer in it. And this one is through the composition and the feel of it. I love the artist Wilhelm Hammershøi. I mean, if you see his work, it'll make sense because he actually looks a lot like Randall Exxon. So there are these works I like that don't really look like mine, but it's very quiet and ghostly, and there's just this silence and that envelops you when you see it. And he did a lot of paintings of the building where he lived, the rooms where he lived with his sister. So there's just an intimacy to it, this feeling that you're in someone's private space, that you're part of someone's life, that I really like with his work. So there's a lot in this composition that directly quotes Hammershøi paintings.
So Hammershøi was a Danish artist who spent all his life in Copenhagen, but worked a little bit for a little while near the British Museum in London, but he is known for these very moody, sort of monochromatic, which is not how we describe this, interiors, which included his sister, his wife, and often seen from the back. So a kind of pensivity is totally a part of it. It's an amazing reference, which you know is not something necessarily that you'd expect for a painting which is 7 feet by 9 feet. This is a very big work. And it's a picture which also is made using acrylic, transfers, colored pencil, and charcoal on paper. So let's start with acrylic. How did you come to acrylic paints as your choice?
So I went to the Pennsylvania Academy, which was actually the first place where I got introduced to Hammershøi. So this is also, there's a lot of references to my academic lineage. So this is like, hey, Papa, you guys taught me about this guy. So after I left PAFA, I was doing very, like I was doing stretched linen with rabbit skin glue and lead ground, like the whole like back to the way it was done hundreds of years ago kind of painting. I was using oil.
Mm-hmm.
But then my first semester in grad school, I had applied to graduate school when I felt my work had not stagnated, but almost like had reached the furthest I could go by myself, and I needed help to help me see how I could push it forward. I was at a point where I knew, kind of had an idea of where I wanted to go in terms of content. I knew what I wanted to talk about, but I didn't know how to do it. I felt like the paintings I was doing wasn't jiving with what I wanted it to say. So when I got to grad school, my first semester, I realized I had to pretty much stop what I was doing and start from scratch. So I thought of it as, I mean, the way I explain it is almost like taking a toolbox and turning it over and shaking everything out, and then just putting things back as is necessary or as you need it. And so because I was trying to figure a lot of things out, I was doing a lot of experiments in my studio, which is why I got the "we don't know what you're doing" letter. I was doing a lot of experiments. I was trying out different ways of working, different ways of making images. I was doing lots of collage work. I was drawing a lot. I was still painting. I was doing watercolor washes. And what I realized was that if I wanted to work through ideas quickly, I couldn't spend a semester working on one painting. And so I realized that the way to work quickly through ideas was to use something that dried fast, because this was also a point where I knew I was interested in layering and building. And so acrylic seemed like a good idea. For a long time, I was doing like ink washes. I was doing stencil overlay cutouts. But I was very hesitant on acrylic because I felt like everybody I loved at that point was using oil. I was like, very into Caravaggio and Zurbarán and Vuillard. And I just thought, oh, but you can't make acrylic luminous. I don't know how to do it. And every time I tried it, things looked flat. And then one day I walked into the Yale University Art Gallery and they had a Kerry James Marshall on display. And I don't know if people listening have had this experience, like that one artwork that you remember the day you saw it. And it's like, your life as an artist has not been the same since. I feel like I was standing in front of it. My mouth was open, not for like a second, for a very long time. And it was like, I'm like getting goosebumps. Like every time I think about that experience, I get goosebumps. I mean, there was like, first of all, there was the phenomenal impact of, because it was right, like when you walked in the main walkway, it was right at the end. So there was just the power of seeing that incredible Black woman with the palette. She was an artist and big hair. And she's looking at you like, yes, this is my space. You do not see that a lot.
Right. That very direct gaze that she has, that amazing locked in gaze.
Claimed ownership of that museum space in a way that historically hasn't happened a lot. And then to see that this luminous, beautiful, incredibly made work was done with acrylic. So what that also made me realize was it was possible to make phenomenal luminous paintings with acrylic. And then the challenge I had for myself was to try and figure out how to do it. So I started experimenting a lot with acrylic, and I still do. I will make lots of little tabs and samples and play around with the things I mix into it. Like what happens if you paint by layering 4 different layers, then it has a little bit more. I mean, like if you...
Go ahead. Just tell me where.
The door, the dark side of the door, the inside.
This
yes,
part.
if you go down, yeah, that area. But I think that was got by like, it was layered, and then towards the bottom, I mixed in crushed steel to the paint. So there's some of these I had to photograph because they have things that really reflect and shine if you see it in real life. But then also playing with areas that are more translucent, areas that are put on in different ways. So you actually begin to have acrylic not just act like this very dull plastic that doesn't shimmer or bounce back light for us.
So Kerry James Marshall works on panel, PVC panel. So you using paper though, you're working on, you know, a very different kind of support. Is that because it aids in the transfer process that you developed?
Yes, so there's the logistics reason, which is I have tried the transfer on canvas, and you can transfer on canvas. It's not the look I'm interested in. I want a very specific abraded quality that I get best on not just paper, but on a very specific type of printmaking paper.
You said, sorry, you said abraded quality, right?
Abraded, yeah, sorry, abraded.
No, I'm just clarifying because it's interesting, because if I think about things like, you know, what Rauschenberg used to do on canvas with silk screening, you didn't want to do silk screening. It makes it too clean. It's too precise. So this is something which works really well.
Exactly. And also I think back to my first year in grad school. I finally looked down and saw a comment. It's Reeves BFK paper. I buy it in rolls and I seam them together so do you see the image of the Virgin Mary?
Oh, here.
Yeah, right above her hand, you can see that faint line.
Yeah, right here.
Horizontal. That's where the paper is seamed together. So it only comes in a 42 foot wide roll. So when you see big pieces of mine, it's lots of smaller pieces of paper glued together.
Well, Michelangelo and Raphael had the same problem. They couldn't get big enough paper.
But also when this work was still being figured out, I was trying to get to a point where every decision I made in the work was conscious. I didn't want to just fall back on things because this is what you're meant to do. And so just thinking of that, pouring the toolbox out and putting things back slowly, one of the questions I had for myself is like, one of it was like, why am I even using oil if oil doesn't fit what I'm trying to do? If I'm trying to do all this layering, you have to give oil days to dry and it just doesn't work out. Another question I had for myself is, why am I painting on canvas? I wanted everything I did to be a very conscious decision. And so one, painting on paper is just like a slightly rebellious part of me, being like, I'm bucking this way of painting I used to do before. But it also suspends my work in this space where it is drawing. And it's important to me that it lives in this space between painting and drawing and printmaking, because the content of the work is actually about existing in different spaces and how you kind of aren't just one, but this new being that has aspects of those different spaces but isn't tied to anyone. So thinking of me as like the girl who grew up, spent time in the village. I'm a town girl, I'm a Lagos girl a little bit, I'm also American, and who I am is a mix of all those things. All those things have come together to yield a new thing, a new like trans culture. And so thinking of this work that is hard to pin down. And I mean, I love that my work has been included in vitamin P, which is for painting, and vitamin D for drawing. So
from Phaidon,
yeah, something like that makes me think, yes, it's doing what I want it to do. And it's always hard for me when I apply for things that you have to check, is it painting or not?
Right.
Like, I don't know.
It's interesting. The Metropolitan, of course, owns Your Great Mother and Child from 2016, and they classify it as drawing. And does that mean it lives in the drawing department, or it can't be shown by, the contemporary art department unless they apply to the drawing? It's hard to say. So I was interested to see that. So can you briefly describe sort of what you're doing with the transfer process, and especially the elements there behind your sister in the image?
So the transfers I have, so the transfers are not collage. Transfer is a printmaking technique where you print out a picture and you put it face down. I put it face down on my Reeves BFK paper, and using a solvent, in my case, acetone, I transfer just like a very thin layer of ink from the printed paper onto my Reeves BFK paper. So I have an image bank that I've been putting together since I finished at Swarthmore, since 2004. Because after I finished Swarthmore, I went back to Nigeria for a year. And the Nigeria I went back to in 2004, 2005 was very different from the Nigeria I left in 1999. There was just this renaissance happening in the country, in music, in like Hollywood, not Hollywood, Nollywood had already exploded. Nigerian music was taking over the continent and to some extent the globe, Nigerian fashion. So I was seeing all this stuff happening, and I felt like there was this new generation of Nigerians that were, the Nigerian writer talks about how, this is years ago, Chinua Achebe talked about how Africans had to tell their own stories. And I think he said something along the lines of, the story will always glorify the hunter if it's the hunter writing it and never the lion. Mm-hmm. So just talking about the importance of speaking for yourself and not having people from outside speak for us. That's how you end up with things like Heart of Darkness. And so I was seeing this cultural explosion happening, and it was very fascinating. I started taking a lot of pictures. I started collecting a lot of pictures of the fashion designers I was going to visit, the magazines I was seeing around Nigeria at the same time. And so that's how the image bank started. So what I'm doing is taking images from my photo bank and using the acetone transfers to grade them, to kind of put them into certain designated areas in the work. And they're usually to add cultural, historical content to the work. And with this one, the images on the table of my grandmother's, the objects on my grandmother's table are also transfers. It's just done differently, where I took one picture and I blew it up and printed it in little sections, and then I had to tile it together. Once again, printmaking.
And all these things like these album covers and magazine covers and images, you can change the scale, the size of them as you see fit, but they'll all come out reversed, right? In the images. All
come out reversed, but if I want it to come out the right way, then I just reverse it before printing. So sometimes with the text, I still leave it reversed. It's intentional, because if you want to read it, you can read it. It's not too difficult. Like they're kind of at 10 o'clock from my sister's head, there's like a red image.
Here.
That's Genevieve, the Nigerian actress, and it says New African Woman. And if you're in front of it, you can read it, even though
you can tell. Yeah.
So I just, if it's the right way up, it kind of announces itself too much, and you zoom in on it and latch onto it in a way that kind of takes attention away from everything else and makes it a little bit more than I want it to be. But if there are certain things that I find really important, so like when the Chibok girls were kidnapped and there were all the Bring Back Our Girls protests, I will flip it before I transfer it, because I think it's important to read that text, Bring Back Our Girls. And in some of the works you'll show later that have images from Black Lives Matter protests from Ferguson, I will flip it before I transfer it, because I want those read clearly.
Okay, interesting. So how do you use, if at all, the computer when you're making these kinds of large scale works? Does that factor into your procedure?
Yes. So I am not very good with the computer, and I like to do things by hand. But when I was in graduate school, Peter Halley came for a studio visit once, and I had all these, I was working on a big piece, and I had this area at the top that I had painted. I think I had painted it like yellow, and it didn't work. And then I painted it blue, and it didn't work. And so he said something like, well, instead of spending so much time trying to repaint this big area, why don't you do little studies on Photoshop? And I thought, oh no, I hate technology. But eventually I gave in and I started using Photoshop, and it has become a major tool for me. So usually the compositions I still do by hand, even if I want to, So I'm just like, it's hard to talk about the work if you're not in my studio and I can actually show you process shots and bring out sketches, but I'll try. So I use Photoshop for a lot of determining color choices. That really is what I use it for. For composition, I do lots of little sketches, some of which maybe you can see at the back as I try to figure out what works. So what I do is I make a drawing, a pencil drawing, I take a picture of it, I print out the pencil drawing, and then I do drawings over that to figure out the composition. I will also do stuff like this. I don't know if you see that. I will put a big piece of glassine over something I'm working on and then try to figure out the composition. And once I'm happy with what I have, I trace it out using carbon paper. And the reason why I do that is because the transfer has to go on raw paper. I kind of have to have a slightly clear idea of where it's going, and I have to keep that area clean. So that's why I was saying this is very akin to printmaking. It requires so much pre-planning.
And that is what also makes it so time consuming, because mistakes are very difficult to rectify. I see.
Exactly. They can be fixed, but I always say there's nothing that can be fixed. It can just take a few days to fix it.
And you display these, as people have seen, I'm sure, just with clips on the wall. So not glazed, not in boxes, not framed.
That is my ideal way of displaying it, once again, because no, there's a finished work here. I was thinking I could bring the computer close and show people, but it's covered in plastic, so you can't really see the surface. It's covered in plastic just in case I have an accident and splash paint on the floor.
Or the kids come in the studio and make a mess.
Which happened. One of my kids came the other day and I set up for them down there and they did some painting. And then of course I realized, no, this is not working. They cannot be here when I work. So the reason why I like displaying it on its own with just clips, because I put in a lot of work on the surface, and maybe we can tie this in later if we end up talking about public commissions. These are surfaces that are made for you to really be like this far away from. Nothing gives me joy like when you're like in your own show and you're watching people watch your work. I love it when people come really close to the work. And I think of surface as a way to move people through this very large space. So I already mentioned mixing things into the paint. I mean, I'll mix up crushed steel. I had a friend when my husband was in Baltimore who was working with marble, and I got a bunch of marble dust from him, and I'll mix that into work. I'll mix glass beads. I use a lot of rollers to do very thin layers that I just like put multiple layers on. So sometimes you'll see something that looks like a tan, but when you come close to it, it's like 4 different colors layered together and everything just kind of shimmers through. So the surface is so important to go from this quality of the transfers to this very flat graphic. If I'm looking at the one in front of us, to go from this like weird rough transfer of the table to that pink at the top that kind of shows like my Peter Halley influence from having gone to Yale. And then you go into the Hammershoy influence. So really making these moves in different ways of image making, different ways of painting. And so I want people to have the experience when they're far away and you kind of enjoy the image, and then you come up close and you kind of enjoy the surface of it. And a lot of that is not lost, but reduced when it's behind glass. But I also understand that they are very delicate. I actually had a sad story where I borrowed a work. This was years ago, maybe in 2012. A work was borrowed for an exhibition somewhere and it tore when they were bringing it down. So I understand, oh God, I probably shouldn't have said that here because now everybody will want to frame it. So I understand when people, it was fixed, it looks perfect, you can't even tell. I understand why people want to frame it. So I don't begrudge them wanting to frame it. But I always focused on showing it first as is. Then after that, you can do what you want.
Has that situation arisen where a museum will want to put it in a frame and with glazing and display it that way?
Yes, and they have. So I have specifications about what kind of glass they should use and all that stuff. So that we can see as much as we can given the framing. Right.
Yeah. So let's talk a little bit about the how this then translates to the public works and this kind of installation that you see here, digital print on vinyl. And people should notice also that if you look quickly at the left side of the original painting, that it's expanded here on the left in the later image. So there's a little bit of fluidity. So maybe talk just briefly about this, and then we'll look at the version of it that emerged in Los Angeles.
Yeah, so with this, I think this actually might have been the first commission I was invited to do. So the Jane from the Whitney Museum reached out to me, and they invited me to do this billboard project. And I sat on it for a little while. I wasn't quite sure. On one hand, I was thinking, oh, I put so much work into surface. My surface is important. These are meant to be seen in real life. I mean, at that point, I didn't even like having my work disseminated online and in computers. I felt like it just like reduced it in a way. I mean, now I've been fortunate that my work has been shown widely. I mean, given how few the works are, and some people have got a chance to see it in real life. But I remember when I was at the Studio Museum, when I was just beginning, I had so many visits where people would come in and be like, oh, this did not look how I expected from seeing it online. And I thought like, yeah, I know, it doesn't translate. So I felt like I didn't want to do this because of that. But then the other hand, you know, I felt it's so important to have this work there. And a quote I keep thinking of that it's like one of the driving things for me. I think of it a lot. I talk about it when I do artist lectures is George Gerbner, who was a cultural theorist, and he actually founded, let me have some water. He founded the Cultural Environment Movement, which was an advocacy group promoting greater diversity in communication media. So he said, representation in the fictional world signifies social existence. Absence means symbolic annihilation. And I thought, like, can you imagine what it means to have up next to the Whitney at the end of the High Line, where thousands of people will see this while it's up, an image like this. So that has really been the part that has made me kind of like drop my reluctance to do public commissions. And now I actually really love them. And I have a story for the Mocha mural when we get there.
Okay. I think it's amazing how you see it here, because many of your works are sort of, the perspectival system is off to the side or askew, but here it lines up perfectly with the orthogonals of the street in the kind of immediate sort of head-on recession of the room. And it has a kind of illusionism, which is quite wonderful there.
Thanks. And you asked about the difference between this. So this actually ended up being its own work because I expanded it digitally. So this is called Before, Now, After. So this was expanded because of the aspect ratio of the space they gave me. I didn't want to have empty white bands at the end. And I didn't want to cut into the image to make it fit. So I expanded it, and I was very happy with it.
Yeah. So let's see what happens to it when it moved across the country to LA. This is the installation Adobo, Country, City, Town, Ancestral Village, from 2 years ago on Grand Avenue on the exterior of Mocha. And you can see this is a large scale view, and all of this is applied there to the surface of the building. And here is the work that we've been looking at. And here's a detail.
Yeah, so obodo is an Igbo word that really means all those things. It means your ancestral village. So my obodo is Agolo, where I used to go to visit my grandmother. Obodo is a town, it's a city, it's a country. So I was really thinking of how that word speaks to, you know, what I've been talking about, this inhabiting different spaces. So I got this invitation from MoCA, I think it was right around Thanksgiving, and they wanted it up in like a month. The turnaround was very tight. So I knew I couldn't make a new work. So I had to use something that already existed. And if you can go back, if you can please go to one of the images where we can see, yeah, so that's great. So because of the way the building moves around, is cut up, and there is another side to the building, it wouldn't have worked to take one picture and stretch it out. So I knew that it had to be like a moving story. And I was so thrilled with this commission. I was very happy with what I came up with. I wanted it to feel like this seamless space where there was, you can just leave it, it's okay to leave it on this picture, where there's at the bottom corner, my sister in the pink, and I wanted the other piece, home, which we'll see later, to almost be like the living room part of the dining room where she was sitting. And then the image we can see right at the end of the figure in the green scarf and the yellow top to be like a painting hanging on the wall next to the painting of the little yellow painting of the guy in the Knights of St. John's outfit. So I wanted it to feel like one continuous room, but made up with different images. They ended up being 7 different works that were either cut up and expanded and seamed together. And the reason why I said yes to this commission, and just every time I see the picture, it makes me happy. I'll use a story to talk about this, but Daniel Palmer, who I had worked with many years ago with Doron Langberg. Daniel curated a 2-person show with me and Doron Langberg. It was like in the basement of a coffee shop in New York in like 2011 or 2012. But we've been friends since then. But he had come to Los Angeles for Frieze last year. And later on, he sent me this really long email, and he said he was in a cab driving by MoCA, and the driver was Nigerian. And the driver asked him, I think the driver had picked him up from MoCA. And so as they were driving, the driver said something like, I pass this building all the time. What is it? And Daniel said, it's the Museum of Contemporary Art. And then the driver started telling Daniel about the work on the facade. I was like, oh, woman in that picture is Dora Akunyili, and she was this Nigerian woman who was in charge of the FDA, and she did this and she did that. And Daniel was just in awe. She's like, I know the artist, she's my friend, but I didn't even know all this other aspects to it. And I felt like that's why, one, it was so important to just have a building like MoCA be covered with images of Black people in a space that historically has kept out people that society had marginalized in other ways. Black people, women, LGBTQ, people with disabilities, and all other marginalized groups. So to take this kind of ownership over that space was very important to me. But also with the public projects, just thinking of how there are demographics that have been kept out of going to museums, maybe because they haven't felt welcome in it. And sorry, this is making me think of an incredible episode of Here to Slay, which is a podcast with Roxanne Gay and Tracy McMillan Cotton, where they had Kimberly Drew come to do a discussion with them. And they were talking about this feeling that a lot of Black people have of like this feeling that the museum is really not a space for them. And it's something, I know a lot of museums are working to change it, but it has to do with the histories and how when people worked into those spaces, they didn't see themselves reflected. They didn't feel like they mattered in this space. So then why should you keep going there? And so I was thinking I had this desire to reach a more diverse audience, especially people who do not go to museums for various reasons. So I've been happy with the outdoor projects.
I don't think I've ever had an artist be so ecstatic about what was clearly an incredibly short-term commission that you had to put together really quickly. And, you know, you had such a wonderfully positive experience with it. It's magnificent. I wish I had seen it. There's just a few more details of the work. That's really striking, this one. But I wanted to point out also to people that, you know, your flexibility with it, in a sense that you actually flipped the original painting to do this so it would fit better at the site, you know, and because the site specificity of it is important. And as you described before, it's a new work. It's a different work. It's not the same work. You know, and I think the history of Los Angeles and, you know, like the Great Wall of Los Angeles with works by so many different artists overseen by Judith Baca. There's such a history of these kinds of murals there, which are meant to connect with a broader audience than necessarily ever sets foot inside the doors of the museum. So let's look at some of your works. I just wanted to point out so we can move on to the standalone works, but you also did a commission at Brixton Station, the underground station in London, South London. Here, this wonderful piece, which you can see as you come in off the street, and then as you go down the stairs to enter the tube, and is a work called Remain Thriving from 2018, which you know is a temporary installation, right? It's
yes,
no longer there.
It's down. So this, I was invited by the Underground, the London Underground, to do a piece in Brixton. And Brixton is a very complicated area because it's the place where a lot of Caribbean immigrants settled when they came to the UK right after the Second World War. So after the Second World War, London had been bombed out a lot and they needed people to help rebuild. So of course they needed manpower. So what they did is they reached out to the colonies and they asked people to come help them rebuild. And a lot of Caribbean people moved to London, they helped rebuild. And of course they dealt with terrible stuff. Racism, nobody would rent houses to them. People would not give them jobs. They lived in terrible living situations. So a lot of them went to Brixton and really formed a community to you know, support themselves. Just this feeling of we have to do this for ourselves because they don't care about us. And so Brixton was just this thriving, incredible place. In the 80s, there was an uprising very similar to what's happened in Ferguson. It's happening again. A police killed a Black British citizen, and there was an uprising which created this this myth of Brixton being very dangerous. But what's happening now is Brixton is getting gentrified a lot as people are finally realizing, oh my God, this is an amazing neighborhood. It's right next to the Tube, which in London is incredible. And then the Black people who've stayed there for decades and have put their sweat and blood and tears into this area and have made it thrive are being pushed out. So there was all this history of Brixton, and there's also the stuff that was happening in London with the Windrush generation. The Windrush generation are the Caribbeans who came after World War II to help London rebuild. So they're called Windrush because they came with this ship called the Empire Windrush. So now some of them, their grandchildren are being denied citizenship. And they're having to prove that they're British. It's horrible. They're getting deported. They're being kept out of school and social services and healthcare. I mean, it's like just the same shit all over the world. I'm sorry that I have to.
Yeah, same as here, right? Johnson and Trump are of the same cloth.
Just like hate of immigrants and Black people and brown people. Because, you know, if your grandparents came with the Windrush and you're born in London, you're a British citizen, you don't question it. And if you don't travel, you have no need to go get papers. And so what they did is that it was very deliberate. They instituted this rule. Oh God, I wish I had written it down, but whatever it was called has to do, is referenced in this title. It's something like, it's not failure to remain, but it has to do with like, frustrating people so that they will not stay if they're illegal immigrant or if they're undocumented immigrants. So it's like if you can't use healthcare unless you show your papers, you can't go to school unless you show your papers. But it's like, if you've never had to go apply for papers, you don't have it. And then like some of them don't have documents that their grandparents gave. It's really terrible. So when I got invited to do this, and also Brixton has a big African population. Whenever I went to London, Brixton was where I went to like buy my cool African sneakers and African fashion. So when I got invited to do this, it was a very tough ask because, you know, people always talk about people from another space making work about the space. I don't think the question is that, oh, you can't make the work if you're not from that space. I think the problem people have is when you don't do it well and when you don't do it respectfully. So I was so nervous about this project. I just felt like I wanted to do it right. I didn't want to, you know, do something like American Dirt, where you're just talking nonsense talking about something you're not qualified to talk about. Right. So I took months. I took about 4 months off to do research on this project. I went to Brixton twice. I stayed there for a while. I spent a lot of time at the Black Cultural Archives. There is, oh God, my memory is failing me. There is another archive a little bit farther from Brixton that I went to. I talked to a lot of British artists. There's a guy who did this wonderful book called Front Room. So this is actually based off a British front room, which is like this architectural style you see in a lot of their houses. So this is an image that was for that station. And so with this, all the transfers are from Brixton, either contemporary and a lot of historic pictures from Brixton that I got from the various archives I went to when I was there.
Huh. And it also, you know, it's the front room is the key room in these kinds of row houses, these, you know, row houses where everyone congregates and either around the fire or record player there. There's a, you know, there's always these kind of iconographic indicators of time in your work. And
so
everyone needs to notice these things.
Yes. So I was looking at photographs by this artist called Neil Kenlock, and so many people posed next to their record player. It's very like Malik Sidibe in Mali in the 70s, where you had to like show off your goods to show that you were cool. So that was like my little wink or reference to that.
Yeah. And it also falls under a British tradition in art, which dates back to the 18th century, called the conversation piece, which was essentially portrait painters, instead of doing portraits of single people, which cost too much money for some of their patrons would have the whole family gather in a single painting. If you go to the Yale Center for British Art, you'll see plenty of examples of these by Arthur Davis and other artists. And it sort of nicely sort of fits into that, but brings it into a natural sort of domestic environment here in Brixton. It's interesting to hear you talk about the Brixton uprising through the lens of what's happening now, because of course, usually referred to as the Brixton riots. But again, here you have a situation where someone was killed by police, and then there was a protest, and then, you know, things went bad because of police activity. So to call the uprising seems to me like a necessary sort of historical determining factor in rethinking all these kinds of events which happened in the past, and now that we're living in this moment of historic change, we hope.
Yeah, so with this, I just felt Brixton is such it's like an actress. So many Black British people pass through that station every day. And I know that it's the same here, just people that have thrived in spite of so much opposition. In spite of the governments working against them, the institutions working against them, their neighbors working against them. And the rule thing they were trying to do, I think someone put in the comments, was called leave to remain. That's like, you need permission to remain. So I kind of wanted to play on that. Like they will remain, they have remained, and they are thriving in spite of this.
So I wanted to perseverance.
Just like this, I think of a lot of my work as affirmations, affirmative. I wanted every time people worked down that, it's like, you know, you guys might be systemically pushing us out, but this is our space. Like, this is us. We built Brixton.
Yeah. So let's look at some of your work, such as this one, The Beautiful Ones, from a series dating back to the mid-2010s. And they are largely paintings which are produced from photographs, some of which are family members, some of which are photographs of people that you met or on travels or that you found. And they have this sort of similar motif, upright portrait format, and with, of course, the transfer technique. This one is series number 4 from 2015. This might be a good work to help us sort of unpack what you do. And here is presumably the source photograph from which you derive this image.
Yeah, so I have a series. I think right now there are 9 of them. They're all of little children. It's all the same size apart from one. They're all kind of in the same space within each work, looking straight at the viewer. They're like the only things I have that are pretty much straight portraiture. And a lot of them are based off family pictures. The first was my sister's, and then I had one that was based off a picture of my brother from when he was a kid. And this is based off my sister's first Holy Communion from when she was a child. But so the title, I talked of how I give like winks and nods to people I like. The title comes from a very popular Ghanaian novel called The Beautiful Ones Are Not Yet Born. And for these, thinking of affirmations, I feel like I'm saying like, hopefully the beautiful ones have been born and they are my generation, because the beautiful one was written in my parents' generation, and it was about the hope that generation had about how things would change and be better after various West African countries became independent. But sadly, that didn't happen. In Nigeria, we just ended up having a military dictator after military dictator, and corruption, and everything just went down the drain. But there is this like renaissance happening. So I'm kind of claiming it for my generation, like the beautiful ones have arrived. So this is my sister in her confirmation dress, and the bench and the window in the back actually pulled from pictures from my grandmother's house in the village. And the doll on the bench is a clonette doll. I felt like a picture of somebody in a white dress doing some kind of First Holy Communion stuff is not specific. There's no specificity to it. It can be from the southern parts of the United States. It can be from a South American country. So I was thinking of something that had more specificity to it. So I found myself wondering, what toy would we have played with when we were young? And I remembered these dolls. And then I spent a lot of time online trying to find them. And then once I found it, the history was so fascinating, because when I was trying to research it, I just assumed like, I don't know, these were designed in the UK and sent to us as many things were. But then what I found out is like they were actually designed and made in Ghana. And they were kind of like a contemporary version of their Aquaba dolls, which you're showing in the picture. So it's just showing how just like wide-reaching white supremacy is. Like, these dolls are being made for use and consumption by African children, but they're of, I mean, like, this has no connection to us. It's like this little Caucasian girl holding, I think it's chrysanthemums, which is a flower we do not have, and had teddy bear. But most of us used these dolls when we were young. And of course, I'm always interested in like the things that speak to post-colonial commerce, things that speak to colonial commerce, things that speak to post-colonial commerce. So from thinking these were maybe designed in the UK, maybe made in China or somewhere else with cheap labor and sent to West Africa, and then to realize that these dolls were designed in Ghana based off of traditional Aquaba dolls that were wooden, made for consumption by West African kids. And then the next step to this, which is very fascinating, is that these are now very big collector's item within the like interior design circle in Europe. So I actually asked my brother to go to the market and buy one of these, and the people at the market were just like, oh no, we haven't seen these in years. So it's just more profitable, I guess, for the makers to ship it abroad than to sell it to us anymore. So it's just this stuff that keeps on going.
And it's interesting also, I think, like work like this, that it becomes, as you've talked about, a part of your kind of vocabulary of imagery. So I'm showing here on the right, the beautiful ones, series 1C from 2014. And this is your other sister, correct?
Yes, my eldest.
Your eldest. And if you notice on her right shoulder, she has there, you've put a transfer of that source image for the work on the left. So there's a wonderful sort of continuum that runs throughout your work. And I think the more that people look at your work, the more that things become recognizable, and the way that you have sort of claimed all these images, not just as something which is autobiographical, but also the way that you've, of course, as you talk frequently about, you've adapted these kinds of pop cultural things which were brought into Nigeria post-independence and in your youth, and turned it into something of your own. I think it's a radical gesture. It really is.
That's the plan. No, thank you for pointing that out. And I keep talking of how there is this lexicon that has been forming in the work. And I get very excited when multiple works are shown at once, because you can actually begin to play a game, like kind of trying to see where things ping from one work to the other. There are lots of winks and recurring themes and recurring pictures and like inside jokes and things like that.
Yeah. Well, I think related to the story that you told about the cab driver in LA, you've talked in other interviews about the idea of developing a new audience for your art. That also is a radical gesture. I mean, avant-garde art has been trying to do that since the 19th century. And the idea that certain people will understand these works better than the normal audience for fine art, if that makes sense. And, how do these works then become accessible to people in Nigeria, to young people in Nigeria, or across Africa, really?
Yeah, I think what really helped me develop this way of working, this kind of thinking of bifurcated audiences, thinking of multiple audiences, was going back to Hazel Carby's class, and also another class I took about art and architecture of, oh snap, I don't remember the name of the class, but we read Chinua Achebe's Arrow of God in it. Oh, no.
It was a while ago.
It was an African literature class.
Okay.
But between those two classes, I think I had read Achebe my whole life, but just reading it again in graduate school with these phenomenal professors and co-students and trying to analyze it. I think, sorry, I'm going to tell a story. But I had read Chinua Achebe's Arrow of God, and I love that book. It's just, it's phenomenal. And he's doing this thing where he's playing with language, where in some chapters, he's kind of using this language that we're used to seeing white people write about Africans. There's very stiff, like, very, very condescending, racist language. And then in certain chapters we get the view of the Nigerians, where he's within that space telling their story. And it actually creates a contrast between both languages that is such a damning critique of writing about writing about the writings that came out about Africa. So what happened when I went to class for the Arrow of God discussion is I was so excited to go and talk about this. I always say reading Achebe for me is like going home, because when we get to those chapters where it's coming from within the space, even though it's written in English, a lot of the speech is direct translations from Igbo, my language. So I actually hear my language in my head, because you know, patterns are different. There's specificity to speech. The way we phrase things in Nigeria is very different from the way someone will phrase something in Mississippi. It's very different from the way someone will phrase something in, I don't know, in the UK. The language has specificity to it. So I remember going to class, and I was so surprised when other people in my class had a very different experience from what I had. They enjoyed the book, they could analyze it, but they felt removed from it, whereas I felt like within the space of the book. And that was when I really started to go back and reread Achebe and try to get down to the how of how he was doing what he was doing. Because I felt like if I could figure it out, I could extrapolate from that and use it in art. And so what I do is like, there is a lot of the work that is about the painting tradition I came out of, which you have to remember is the Pennsylvania Academy of the Fine Arts. We were taught the way painters were taught to paint 100 years ago. We did paintings from life, we did paintings from the cast, and we did paintings from models, morning till night, 5 days a week for 2 years. So that is the tradition I have. So that comes across in the painting. There is a lot in these works that speaks to painting and color mixing and surface and transparencies. So there is that audience. And then there is a whole other discussion that has to do with having lived in Nigeria at a certain time. And that was just like a discussion I felt after having lived in America for a while. I hadn't seen, you know, like if you're an immigrant in the United States, you get some really ignorant questions that shows how very little people know about anywhere outside of the United States. And I just felt like I wanted to show the life I had lived, the Nigeria I know, and go back to and experience in various ways. Now I'm just like, what was the question?
Well, no, I mean, that totally fleshes it all out. And
yeah, so
the idea that someone will then discover it, you know, and will understand it in a way that you understood
exactly.
You know,
and I want to say,
literature.
And if you're a painter, you will, I put a lot into this works to engage with painters. When I make this work, I'm actually thinking of someone like one of my good friends, Doron Langberg, who is a phenomenal painter. Yeah. He's like the person I think of. I want to engage a painter like that, or like Catherine Murphy, or, you know, like those painters you look up to. But then there's also this part that wants to engage people that had that experience that I had growing up in Nigeria. And for me, it's like people who have the experience of the village, people who have the experience of the town, people who have the experience of Lagos. So that's also that's also like split up. So it's like if I have a picture and I put if you're looking at a work of mine and there's a transferred picture of someone like Sani Abacha, who was a president and died right before I left Nigeria, if you don't know him, you can still, you know that it's a reference to some military person. The African military dictator iconography is so well known, you know, like the military hat and the glasses. And so everybody knows. If you see the picture, you'll probably figure out that he's a military dictator. But if you're Nigerian, you know, like all the baggage that carries and the journalists he killed and just how tyrannical he was.
Yeah. So let me just show a couple more things and then we'll get more into this. So,
and I want to say thanks to the people who are still hanging around. I just realized we've been talking for a long time.
Yeah, no, we have a lot of people who are hanging on your every word, 300 strong. So I think we should keep going a little bit longer and then we'll open up to some questions. How's that? How's that sound? So I just wanted to show this work, Nuan Tinti from 2012, and maybe talk a little bit about it and the way that you develop characters in your work, the way that so many of them come out of your relationship with your husband, Justin Crosby, who's a sculptor, whose work I also find really interesting, and they sort of hang in the balance, and there's tension and a lot of things that it feels like you deal with, you're both kind of dealing with from very different sort of visual angles. But when I look at a work like this, wearing my art historian hat, which never comes off, I think about a wide range of images and works from the history of European art, which you are obviously aware of and accessing and repurposing, let's say. Like at the bottom left, you have Manet's small but powerful sketch of the suicide from 1881. And at the top right is an artist who I think has a lot of commonality with the kinds of things that you're doing in tonality and form. This is Walter Sickert's painting, which is usually called now the Camden Town Murder, but it actually was originally called What Shall We Do for the Rent? What Shall We Do for the Rent? So it has more of a kind of domestic element than something more sort of from the tabloids. And then of course at the bottom right is Yinka Shanabare's fake death picture, the suicide Manet from 2011, just a year before your work. So when I see these things, I think about these kinds of works, and I think of Vuillard, the Nabi painter, just had a show at the Met of his work, and these kinds of things which seem so related, but of course that only gets me so far, right? Because I don't know the Nollywood film history, right? I don't know the history of Nigeria. I don't know the African music from the 1980s. I know a little bit of Mali music, but you know, stuff like High Life and Sweet Mother and things which you talk about in interviews. And you know, it's that part of it which really is equally gripping. The idea of, you know, I want to learn about these things because they clearly come into the whole cholen or stew that you're making here in these kinds of extraordinarily visually gripping pictures.
Yes, and thank you so much for making all those connections. So there are lots of images of people draped over beds, and I had those in my mind for years. So this is one of those pictures that proves like we're actually just cycling through a very small group of ideas and just like revisiting them. So I did this in 2012, but there was a day I found an old sketchbook from when I was at PAFA, which would have been 2005, 2006. And I was looking through the sketchbook and I saw a drawing of this. It was like a stick figure drawing, but it was on a park bench. So for a long time, I knew that I wanted to do, and I was like, how much should I confess? I'm a romantic. Now it's out there. I wanted to do something that was sweet. I know people kind of like cringe at it.
We can talk about sweetness and we can talk about beauty.
Yeah,
that is not anathema to the rail.
Yeah, I felt like I didn't feel like I could do it, or I had permission to, and finally I just felt like, hey, I'm gonna do what I want to do. So this is the image I had thought about for years, but I kept resisting because I felt, it's too sweet. And I was thinking of this like draped over bed imagery you see a lot. I was thinking also of the pietas. I was thinking of this very sculptural aspect of a composition that was very bottom heavy. It almost felt like a pedestal and then everything built up into this kind of like triangle area. And so I just felt like, you know, if I'm going to do this, I'm just going to dive in and embrace it fully, but I didn't want it to be known to everyone. So there's a little bit of a wink in it. But when I was young, there was a very popular Nigerian song called Love Nwantiti, and the album cover is actually is transferred multiple times into this work. So Love Nwantiti ended up kind of becoming part of the lexicon of Eastern Nigeria where I grew up. So usually if you're doing PDA or being super sweet, that's what people say to tease you, like, oh my God, Love Nwantiti, stop already. So I didn't want to put love because then it was like, if you know the reference, once you hear Nwantiti, you're like, oh God, yes, I know what this is. So once I had that idea, I wanted the transfers to have a lot of music references. So this is a very music heavy transfers, thinking of very popular musicians from when I was growing up, like Onyeka Onwenu, Nelu Chendu, Oliver de Kong, and all the way to contemporary Nigerian musicians like Two-Face, The Band, P Square. Who else am I seeing in there? Yeah, those are the ones I can like make out right now. References to Nigerian Idol. And I wanted a lot of the transfers to be red. I wanted to try and make an all red piece because I had seen a Degas painting at the Philadelphia Museum that was just multiple types of red. And I wanted to challenge myself to do something like that. So that's a little bit of the backstory for how this piece came about.
Yeah. I think it's a wonderful piece, and Romanticism is good. I mean, we don't ask Wong Kar-wai to apologize for In the Mood for Love. You know, I mean, this is a timeless subject, and you know, that's those kinds of films and the musical references. It comes together in a really heated way in this kind of picture. It works beautifully. I want to wrap up a little bit so that people can ask questions, but I just wanted to tell everybody that this is going to be an interview which will be in the next issue of The Rail. And if Njideka is not sick of me, we will continue it off camera and expand it. And I want to talk about things like architecture and how that factors into your work. Here's a series of buildings in Lagos, Western House by Nixon and Boris, architects who were local architects who then moved to Ghana and have now dissolved as a firm. But this kind of extraordinary modernist architecture, which we see so often in capitals in Africa. And of course, if you travel through South Africa, you see this all the time, and that the impact on your work. And also, I think biology, there has to be some sort of scientific element that's going on as well that seems very strong in your use of patterning and repetition and organic sort of organization in your pictures. I haven't done all the reading yet because these things come together quite quickly, but I'm not sure if anyone's talked at all about that in your work. And of course,
we'll talk about it in the expanded interview.
We will talk about it. There you go. But just to, maybe we should end up just with one of the more recent works, and you can talk a little bit if you want about what you're up to. And I was going to talk about Ossawa Tanner and Pearlstein, but like maybe this one. How about this one? It's a very recent one, Dwellers, native one, and talk a little bit about what you're up to now, and then we'll open it up to questions.
Thank you. And that actually ties into the piece behind me, which is I moved to Los Angeles in 2014. I've never had a green thumb. I'm that person who will kill a cactus. But I started, I have a good friend, Mike Richards, who went to Collage with my husband. And every once in a while, he'll come and help me out in the studio. And there was this one summer where it was so hot, I had to move the work to our living room, and Mike came over to help. And he started asking me to let him work in our garden because our garden was just weed. It looked like an abandoned house. And he loves gardening. And just through, I mean, he's absolutely transformed it. But just through working with him in the garden, going to different nurseries, talking to different plant enthusiasts, I have become a garden person. I love plants. And I think what it was, I just realized how the rich histories plants carry with them. So my studio used to be in East LA. And Mike came in once and he said, oh, your neighbor has this very beautiful flower. And he just talked about this flower all the time. And finally, we were walking by and the neighbor was there and we started talking to the neighbor. And then it turns out the plant is called plumeria. And the neighbor had moved to Los Angeles from a South American country. And they were telling us that plumeria is very plentiful there. And then after that conversation, I really started paying attention to plumeria. And I noticed like almost every house in East LA, it was like everywhere in East LA. And then you go to certain neighborhoods and you don't see a lot of plumeria. So that really started making me ask if, and East LA is predominantly Latinx. So it made me wonder if people brought plumeria with them to this area where they settled historically, and that's why there's so much plumeria, because it was a tie to home. It reminded them of home. But really, like doing research, going to Huntington, talking to people who work there. Huntington is a big botanical garden in Pasadena.
Full of British art.
Yes.
But I got engaged there. That's when I proposed to my wife.
Beautiful.
There's my revelation.
Oh yeah, I went to Huntington last year, and no, I'm not gonna say we did something that we didn't have, but I took a lot of, because they have plants from all over the world.
Yeah.
Normally when I'm trying to look for plants, I spend a lot of time online, but finally I just took my big camera there. We had a white bed sheet because I want the plants silhouetted. So my husband would hold up the bed sheets and I take pictures. So now I have like an image bank of plants. But just talking to people in Huntington and people who study plants, you realize like when people move with their plants. So you can actually use plants as a way to map movements across the globe. And studying plants and actually realizing like there are things called cosmopolitan plants. And I think a lot about cosmopolitanism in my work, like this moving across the globe. And there are these plants that are cosmopolitan because they're found everywhere, because people have kind of dispersed them all over the globe. And of course, the opposite are native plants, and plants that are still found in just one area. And so I've been doing a lot of research in plants and really playing with those two together. Like, what does it mean if I create a garden scene that has cassava, which especially this particular variety of cassava that I only have ever seen in Eastern Nigeria. Not just in Eastern Nigeria, it even has more specificity to it. I see it in like rural parts of Eastern Nigeria because it's very easy to grow. The tubers are very big and you can make a lot of different foods from it. So it really is like the base of rural diet. So when I was young, I always knew I was getting close to the village once I start seeing cassava farms. So thinking of the specificity of that, what does it mean if I make a work with cassava next to an Indian rubber plant, which is a plant that is native to India, but has become naturalized to the United States and different parts of the globe. So doing research into things like tropical almonds, into plants we have in Nigeria that I can't even find because I don't know the scientific names for them, and really using these in compositions. So maybe I'll show this, but I did a piece, recently where there's like a window looking outside to a plant scene, and it's cassava and fluted pumpkin, which is found in Eastern Nigeria, and a tropical almond. So now this new piece I'm working on is to imagine that I'm doing a piece that is kind of like in the space where we're seeing through the window, the other side of the wall. So it's a character based off of me. I'm holding my 1-month-old child who has on the Studio Museum Black is Beautiful onesie. And we're kind of just surrounded by this invented garden of Madagascar jasmine, a fig plant, and different plants. So that's
I was gonna ask you when the kids were gonna make an appearance as characters.
First time.
This is it, right? The time is now.
So I started this right before the Sefer at home. So it's been very slow progress. Yeah.
That's wonderful. So thank you so much. Let's transition. Thank you. I hope you have the energy to ask some questions because we have a lot of people who are really, really engaged in a beautiful way.
I love questions.
Okay, great. So have a little water, shake it out a little bit, shake it out. And Malvika will take over and ask questions and I'll jut in if necessary.
Okay, perfect. Thank you so much to both of you. I just feel like this has been truly incredible. There's been so much feedback in the chat, so many people sort of sharing their own experiences of microaggressions in institutions in grad school. And I personally love everything you've been saying about the invented garden and all of these plants and just like the material objects that speak to like a colonial commerce. I feel like that's really resonated with so much of like very like British items that I imagine British in my childhood, but actually turn out they're homegrown Indian industries. Anyway, this has been absolutely incredible. I'm so happy you were here. So our first question is coming from Donna DeSalvo. Donna, I'm going to request to unmute you now.
Oh, okay. Hello. Can you hear me?
I can hear you, Donna.
Hi, Njideka. How are you? This was so fantastic.
I am well. Thank you. Thanks for staying.
Oh, of course. I just loved it all. I mean, I think you might have answered the question, but it was quite early on when you were talking about the surface, of course, which is so seductive and extraordinary in your work. And what do you feel when museums want to put it behind glass for conservation reasons and stuff? I mean, what's your, I'm just curious. It's such a complicated scenario because of the desire to just let it be. But at the same time, I think so much of the aspects, Rauschenberg was brought up earlier, and I think a lot about like the combines and then the works he was doing in the jammers, which are fabric-based. Maybe we museums have it wrong and just have to.
Thank you so much for that question, Donna. It's hard because I mentioned my dream is for them to hang as they are, but it is tough. So I honestly am okay if people want to frame it, and actually have been meaning to contact someone who wants to put me in touch with a conservator because I want to. I want to talk to them about like, yeah, like what if it's mounted on panel? Would that change things? I have to think of like, what will it take for these not to be framed? Is it just because they're hanging on paper? And I mean, something else, I'm just like, should I put this out there? Because then, okay. So the sometimes when in some of the areas, because of the things that are mixed in it, they actually can get scoffed if people like hit it, especially the areas with like metal filings in them. I mean, I'm able to buff it out. You just take a brush and buff it, but it freaks people out once they own it. But it's also because of insurance. It gets to a point where it's not just the museum's desire. You start dealing with insurance stuff. It's just safest.
Oh, I know. It's all the other stuff.
It's exactly the other stuff after it leaves my studio. It also creates a situation where people don't want to loan it out as much, which is something I'm still trying to figure out because I only make so much. There are not a lot of these that exist.
Yes, yes. Well, thank you. I mean, I could ask you a million questions, but there's so many other people in line. Thank you. It's good to see you.
Likewise.
Thank you, Donna. That's great.
Finally, thanks.
Thank you, Donna. Our next question is a little bit more about process, and it will be from Ray Vargas. Ray, I'm requesting to unmute you now.
Hi, can you hear me?
I can hear you, Ray.
Great. Thank you so much for doing this. It's really amazing to hear about all the ideas and all the thought that goes into your work. So my question was about your process in developing your concepts for your artwork. How much, if any, writing do you do when you are in the research phase and you're developing these ideas, or is it all developed visually with drawings and comps?
Thank you for asking. I do write. I wish I could find an example. When I write, it really is like a scrap piece of paper with words. Like I remember this one, I actually ended up finding the paper that I wrote on and I kept it, but it had like, the words were like queen, religion, tea. So it was just more like a note of all the things I wanted to hit. Because with this piece, I was really thinking of just like all the things that have influenced Nigerian culture. So thinking of the UK, how tea culture is big. And I also have like the British porcelain plates. I was thinking of, so the Clonette dolls make it in, the blue and white striped one. I was thinking of African-American music, because the thing is like, African-American culture is actually the big thing America transports, and one of the things America exports, and how Nigerian music was really influenced by someone like Janet Jackson, Michael Jackson, and you can see a lot of transfers in that work of musicians that are obviously looking to blues, rap, R&B, and stuff like that. So I might have like notes like that. It might just be like, frame in background, what should it be? Family, question mark? So it's that kind of note. Writing gives me anxiety. It really does, which as an artist, you actually have to write a lot, which just makes me want to pull my hair. Because every time you apply to something, every time you write a grant, and I'm just like, no, this is not what I do. You don't ask writers to paint. Why are you asking me to write? I get like really sweaty and I just like pace. So the way I write is more like notes. My stuff is more visual. Do we have a, no, it's fine. I do like visual printouts for the stuff. So like, if you look, the work behind me, the visual printout for it, it had like Clonette dolls. It had a picture of Cardinal Arinze, who is a Nigerian cardinal and a family friend of ours. He had some pictures of like the Pope and some cardinals. So it was more like photo pictures of what I want. And then I try to figure out how many I can hit. Sometimes you can't hit it all and you give up and say, okay, next piece. So that's the kind of writing I do.
Do you want me to put something up? Do you want me to put a picture up?
Oh, I don't have, it's like in my box.
Oh, okay. All right. Next time.
But yeah. Maybe when we do the final stuff, I can.
Okay.
process.
As an artist who feels the exact same way about writing, it's really reassuring to hear how you're able to sort of work through that process and develop these ideas. Thank you so much. I really identified with what you shared about your MFA experience as well. So thank you for sharing that.
Okay, perfect. The next question is coming from Iona Manolak, but I will be reading it on their behalf. The question is, Njideka, the idea of power and the power of images seems to be very important to your work. Their question was, do you expect that power of image to emerge from each of your works? How do you find it? And where do you locate it? And what happens if you don't feel that way from every single one?
I'm going to answer it. Please let me know if you feel I'm not getting the question right. But I think as an artist, you're constantly trying to chase something that is not fixed. Especially for me, I feel like what I'm trying to hit is constantly moving. My relationship to Nigeria is always changing. And something that really got introduced into my work in 2016, because Trump's election really threw me for a loop and left me quite depressed for a while. I couldn't work for the longest time because, I mean, for me, what does it mean that he was elected? It felt like a country I had settled in and called home turned around and rejected me and pretty much said, we don't want you here. You know, just being Black, being an immigrant, being a woman, just hitting a lot of the zingers that he hates. And just really like finally seeing the white supremacy in the country. So just like the point I'm making is like what I'm trying to what I'm trying to get to is constantly shifting. So right around the election time, I realized that I had been in America long enough that I had a stake in this country. I'm very plugged into my local elections and politics, but that wasn't always showing up clearly in the work. So I actually did the series, The Counterpart, where I started introducing a lot of pictures from here, from the United States of America into the work. And as an artist, I think what you do is you make something and it comes close to what you want, but it's never quite right. I mean, it's never quite right because we're very complex, multi-dimensional people, and it's hard to gather all those thoughts in one piece. So it always falls short a little bit, and so then you try and make another work that either augments that or pushes it forward. So for me, I don't know if that answers the question. I never feel any specific work says exactly what I want. I feel on their own, they do an aspect of what I want. So I think the analogy I have for myself with my work, which is the one way I can stay a little bit calm and not get too anxious and unable to work, is to think of them as chapters in a book. And it's a book that is still ongoing. So each chapter hits a different note, but the full story is actually in when they all come together. Talking again, Jason, about all these like connections between the works. They're like characters that recur, there are places that recur. You actually begin to see this world I've been creating for years and this language I'm developing. There are places, I mean, there's like a chair you see. I had a friend of somebody I work with at Victoria Mirror Gallery saw a picture of my living room with my kid, and her reply was just like, I know that chair. I'm like, yeah, if you see my work, you know that chair, because that chair has appeared in maybe like 7 things right now, and it was a chair we got from my husband's grandmother, of a San Francisco-based furniture designer called Maguire, which carries its own connotations and stuff. Anyway, I don't know if that answered the question.
I think it totally did. And I also want to point out to everyone that Njideka, grew up under a military dictatorship her whole life. And this is something I guess we'll get into in the extended interview, that it must be, doubly difficult for you to live through what we're going through in this country since 2016.
I read something that was actually written by a Nigerian that was just saying like, we've seen this playbook. We know how this plays out. I remember talking to someone once years ago, this was before Khashoggi was killed. And I was telling them, like, my God, I'm seeing so many similarities to Nigeria. This like flaunting of law, you get to a point where you can do anything because you act like a king. There is no accountability. And I said something along the lines of like, this is so eerily similar. The only thing that hasn't happened yet is they are not disappearing journalists. And then of course, a few weeks later, Khashoggi killed. I mean, he wasn't killed by Americans, but they also just kind of went, eh.
Yeah.
And I think a lot of people who grew up in dictatorships have been just screaming about how this is a replay of what we've
parallel, right? Yeah. November can't come soon enough. Malvika, go ahead.
Well, but you see what happened in Georgia. Like, that's the thing. Like, I know it's like voting is what we have to do, but then is the election free and fair if they're making it so difficult to vote? I saw something like some people waited for 5 hours.
Yeah.
Like, my God, I love voting and I want to do it. Will you wait for 5 hours? Oh God, maybe if I had a book. It's a lot to ask of people. It really is. It's terrible.
It's true.
So I mean, that it almost seems like how they dismiss people when they complain or protest. It's like, oh, go vote, but they're not admitting that they've systematically made voting very difficult for certain communities.
It is true. Well, we're going to get it out of the system, hopefully, by then. Okay, go ahead for the next
I'll have
question.
champagne.
Yeah.
I will. Oh.
I think we all need champagne for November.
When he goes, I'll have champagne.
Our next question comes from Emilia Cabeza de Baca. I hope I said your name appropriately. It's very beautiful. I'm unmuting you now. Emilia? Let's see.
Might not be.
Yeah, maybe we could return to this question a little later if she tunes in. She might have stepped out for a moment. So let's go for our next question to Okikuwawa Akinfe, who had a question that I think was touched on several questions that were coming in through the chat. I'm unmuting you now.
Hi.
Hello.
Hiya. My question was asking about, with everything that's going on right now, there's like nationwide lockdowns in the world right now, and then there's also the Black Lives Matter protests, and for art students it's a bit of a weird time because you feel like you should be making or you shouldn't be making, and then obviously with the pandemic that's going on now, art studios in art schools are probably going to be very limited, and there's not going to be much access available. So I was just wondering, like, what would your advice be to art students right now in terms of making and producing?
Oh, oof. No, not that I don't know. Just that's a question. No, it's tough. I'm on the board at the Pennsylvania Academy, and they had a meeting 2 days ago, which I really wanted to join because they were going to talk a bit about going back, the logistics. I mean, how do you do it for art students? And I wanted to be part of that and see what they were proposing. But then just an aside, we thought my husband had COVID-19, so he had to isolate here or quarantine here. Ended up he didn't have it, but I couldn't join the meeting because I was watching 2 kids. But it's so tough, and I don't think it's just art students. I think it's artists everywhere. I mean, I'm a little bit. When I finished grad school and I went to New York, I felt like I formed a community there. And I moved to Los Angeles in, you know what? No, scrap that. That's a long story that is not necessary. I guess what I want to say is I'm hesitating, I'm babbling because you've actually hit something that I struggle with and I'm going through, which is, I think this is a really hard time for me. And not to make this about myself. I'm sure some artists are thriving and making phenomenal work, but the past few years I've had so much anger that it has been very hard to work, because sometimes you just want to roll up a piece of paper and scroll obscenities all over it. But then you feel like, okay, but then what? And I think it's so hard because you have to process like what's happening. You almost have to come out on the other side and be able to look back. But it's hard to process because what's happening just keeps piling on. Even before the pandemic started, it just feels like once you just feel like you can breathe from some terrible rule they are trying to establish that is terrible for immigrants and Black people and stuff like that, there's just something else that comes. There's something else that comes. And I just feel like, how do you process this? How do you make work about this that isn't, because sometimes when the anger is so much, it can actually limit the work and the work can breathe and grow and live beyond the specific time. So I've actually been trying to have a lot of patience with myself and realize, and I feel like this makes it seem like, oh my God, I've been working. Like, no, this is since January. And it just finally started moving along. It's just been a lot of sitting at home, reading the news and cursing my phone. And I've just realized I should be generous with myself and just realize this is a year unlike anything we've ever experienced. And it's the solution will be different will be different for different people, and you just have to figure it out for yourself. I'm still trying to figure out how I navigate it. So I think the main thing is like, how can you navigate it for yourself? So something I started trying that seems to be working for me is I realized things are different now. We have to be able to pivot. You can't work the way you were working before the pandemic. So I realized this kind of work, I'm still able to come and do it, but it really has slowed down a lot. And I realized I had to try something different. So I have a few panels that are about this big, and I've been painting in my backyard next to the washing machine. And it's like, they might never get seen, they might end up being terrible, but it just lets me work. It lets me experiment and try new things that don't feel as precious. So I can also see where I take the work from here, because it almost just feels like this past year has been so, it's almost like something has cracked open that I feel like the work, it'll be weird for the work not to respond to that. How it does that, I'm not sure yet. In terms of people going back to school, I actually don't know how that will happen. If schools are planning to do Zoom meetings for painters. So what, sorry, I feel like I'm babbling with this answer, but just, the most important thing is just keep working for yourself. Because what I realized is, like, as artists, we actually figure things out through working. And I keep thinking, like, if one of my mentors in grad school always said, work begets work. We can read a lot, we can study a lot, we can do all that stuff, but in the end, you just have to like sit down and make something. And it's in the making of something that a lot of questions are answered, and you figure out the next thing and the next thing. And that's how ideas are developed and pushed forward. Even if it's just like little experimental things that will never see the light of day. Could be something to do in your room, in a little space you have, as a way to cycle through ideas and not like making a finished work of art. Yeah. I hope that's helpful and hopeful.
No, it was very helpful. Thank you very much. Thanks.
Thank you for asking.
I also wanted to give a quick shout out to Abigail, who is in the chat, who is one among many people who had asked a very similar question of advice to young Black artists entering an industry that is sort of disenfranchising actively. So Abigail, your question was like very beautifully worded, and I just wanted to say thank you for putting it in there. Our next question, so Amelia is back, and I'm going to unmute you now.
Okay, can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yes, okay, cool. Well, first, thank you so much for your time. This has been such a wonderful talk, and it's wonderful to see your work. It's very exciting. My question, so one of my colleagues was on I'm an architect living in Seattle, and one of my colleagues was on a design team for our African American Culture Museum. And he was brought on late in the project, and everybody else on the project was Anglo. And they asked him a question of, how do we get Black people to come to museums? And he was just like astounded at just the question, like he didn't even know how to answer. And so I guess, so my question to you is, your work layers so many experiences of yours, and communicates them in so many different ways. And I wonder if you have any suggestions for how designers of color can layer and express those same experiences, and also speak to their needs and their lifestyles in a three-dimensional built environment.
I mean, the person that comes to my mind immediately is, oh God, this is bad, you know, and just like, how can I forget? David. Someone help me out. David Ajayi, thank you.
Oh, David Ajayi.
Oh, so I mean, so this is an example, for instance, in the last, I mean, he's done in buildings all over the world, but in the last Venice Biennale, Ghana had a pavilion. And I remember walking into the Ghana pavilion, and it took me home. And David Ajayi designed it. And I remember talking, well, first of all, one of the artists actually had dried fish, but not that you should put dried fish in your building, but they had dried fish embedded in the walls. So when you came in, it was like this smell of the Nigerian markets, or like the kitchen when they're cooking stuff with stockfish. And that, you know, like, smell in that case was such a memory thing that took you to a very specific place. And then even the architecture, the space, took me back home. But that's the thing, when things work like that, you might not even be able to articulate why it's doing that, but it is. And then I ended up talking with David because he was there, and he was actually saying that they got sand from Ghana to bring to Venice to do it, because he was saying the point he was making to them is that if he made this wall, because it was kind of like a wall that was covered in sand, if he made it with just sand from anywhere, yes, it will look like a sand wall, but it won't have that same effect. And I walked in, and within a millisecond, that effect he wanted hit me. It was that like, oh my God, I know this wall. This sand is the sand I saw in houses. So it's just like that. The word I keep thinking and I tell people about is specificity. Specificity. It takes a lot of work. It takes a lot of research. And it almost seems like wasted time, because you feel like, yeah, but most people will never know. But if you get it right, it hits people. I mean, like, you know, down to a very particular, so that's, when I look for my pictures, I'm looking for a lot of that just the specificity of things. So if you want to have biscuits, it's not just about having biscuits. Which particular biscuit? What does it say? From what time? What is the image of it? And all those things are tied to so much. And that's where all that content comes in. And it works. It's it really is like the magic of images that is hard to explain. And one way I think of it is, think of like, say when you're walking down the street in New York, how sometimes you see someone and immediately in your mind, you just know like, that's a tourist. And it's like within a second, it's something about like the way they carry themselves, the shoes they're wearing, the way their outfits are put together. That is the power of specificity. It speaks to place and it speaks to time. Like, how is it that when I go back to Nigeria, people can tell that I don't live in Nigeria anymore, even though I speak the language? And I always feel like if I can get to those things, I can actually begin to speak, because we all carry those things with us. It's just being able to kind of put your finger right in it. And the question about Black people coming to the museum, my God, that is so irritating. I mean, Kerry James Marshall had his mastery show at the Museum of Contemporary Art here, which was Helen Molesworth brought it in. Phenomenal show. I went I saw it 3 different times, and every time I was there, the museum was packed with Black people. So it's like, if you create a space where they feel welcome, they will come.
Right, yeah, that's a good point.
It was the same with Met Breuer for that show. It was the same, and not just Black people. I mean, people from all different backgrounds. It was wonderful going to see that show over and over at Met Breuer.
Yeah, I was drawing a design for a church in a predominantly Latinx community, and I gave it to another designer to help add context and entourage, so people, and he added nothing but white people. And our clients came back and they were like, this leaves out half our congregation. So thank you for speaking to specificity and inclusion. Thank you very much.
And I mean, one thing I want to say is even color has specificity, because, you know, it's like, I keep thinking of how a lot of rooms in Nigeria have a very specific kind of blue and a very specific kind of mint to them. I don't know why. I don't know if we just got like multiple containers of this particular shade of paint shipped. And that's the thing, you get to a point where you question your memory. Like, am I just imagining this? But I've actually been watching a lot of old Nollywood movies and seeing all these rooms. I was like, okay, this was a valid thought. I'm not imagining it. So many buildings have this particular color. So if I make a work with that color, someone who grew up in Nigeria at that time when so many interiors were that particular blue will get taken there immediately.
Thank you, Njideka.
Thanks.
Thank you.
That was such an incredible question and answer. And I'm so glad we were able to end on that note.
Yeah, and I want to say, I'm so sorry for delaying Ed's poem.
Oh, no, we're still getting to it. Don't worry.
No, but just for making it.
This is absolutely your show. We're all just here living in it. But I just wanted to say, I really, truly love what you're saying about how every color has a kind of specificity. And it reminded me so much about sort of Kwame Apia's idea that the cosmopolitan city is a place where difference is adjacent to difference. And I just feel like that resonated so much with your collage work.
I love that book, Cosmopolitanism, and that word is always in my head when I'm working.
Yeah.
So difference next to difference. And just like I hate the whole idea of assimilation as a prerequisite for being American. It's like, no, like you don't have to give up your culture. You can just carry the histories you brought with you and exist next to other people, and it actually makes for a richer world. I love his writing.
I can imagine. I really agree with Phyllis in the chat, who said, delay, you are being so generous with your time, which you truly are. There were so many amazing questions we couldn't get to. I want to give a quick shout out to James Sussman, Case Savaglia, Carly Norman, Meredith Palmer, Alan C., and many others. This was like absolutely phenomenal. We had such a richness of questions. Next,
the writer is Kwame Anthony Appiah.
Yeah, we'll drop it in the thing. Next, we're going to go to our phenomenal publisher, Fong Bui, and then we will go to the poem. Fong, I think you should be able to unmute yourself. But I will request to unmute you right now.
Thank you, Mavika. Wow, what a joy to hear you both talking in the way you have. And I couldn't, I think we can just go on forever. The level of energy and pleasure embedded in your conversation is so inspiring. It's not a question, but it can be a question, but why listened to you, I realized that all of us aspire to create is always caught between memory and forgetting. You know, so I think the whole idea of remembering things and forgetting about things. But one thing that I wanted to ask you in regard to Rosenfeld, who did that incredible cantos, the Dante drawing he made in the late 60s, 34 cantos based on Dante Inferno series, where he, you know, combine image transfer, you know, with solvent that you describe your own process, with glossy images from magazine and gold with watercolor and mixing it with his own drawing. And he was one of the people, when you look at the 3/4 mile installation, it reminded me of your installation when you were showing. So I'm asking whether if Rosenfeld had a place among the artists that you admire.
Yes, he does. I feel like I don't talk about him much. I look at him, but not as much as some of the people I've talked about, but he has been very influential, but I also feel like enough people talk about him that I can focus on other people. But I think I look at him a lot for surface inspiration. But also kind of thinking of a new rubrics of image making. Yeah. Just kind of trying to break out and question, because I think what I'm doing that I got inspiration from him from is this, I had this tradition I inherited from Swarthmore through PAFA into grad school. And I'm really trying to think of how I can break it open and find almost like find a new way to rework it. Find a new way to rework it that kind of puts my stamp on it, but also takes ownership of it, especially since that tradition came from like Western ways of painting. Like, how can I, one, take over this thing and then use this thing to talk about Nigeria and my experience growing up. So it's more about this like pushing where next painting and image making can go.
Yeah, well, you certainly have done that. I don't know how you managed to do it, because why, in a way, alluding technical identification to any kind of medium specific, you know, you're able to create a new one, a large elbow room where it can be in between. Is it drawing, is it painting, is it this or is that? Make it. Yeah. So I don't know what it is, but what it is, it's you. It's a work of art. We can agree on that. So thank you so much for being here with us.
Thank you. And I mean, you're also an immigrant. I think with that, I'm thinking of how, as an immigrant, you actually you don't leave your space and assimilate into this. It always comes with you. So you actually end up being a creature of where it's like you're a person who is multifaceted.
Yes.
And each facet is valid and important and unique and adds up to the wonderful, unique person you are. And so the work is like trying to speak to all that.
Thank you. The demand for the right of opacity. That's what we're aspiring to. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you for the invitation. This has been
lovely.
We
have to get you for lunch soon, you know. Thank you, Bobby.
Thank you, Phong. So the Rail has a daily ritual of ending lunch with a poem. Today, we have the absolute pleasure and treat of having the poet Ed Steck, who will be reading for us. Before that happens, though, I will tell you a little bit about Ed Steck. Ed is the author of a number of beautifully titled works, which include An Interface for a Fractal Landscape with Ugly Duckling Press, The Garden, Synthetic Environment for Analysis and Stimulation, The Rose, Sleep as Information / The Fountain is a Water feature, Far Rainbow, A Time Stream in Spaces, The Cultic Parody of Time-Induced Capital, and The Necroluminescence of Pink Mist, which is from Skeleton Man Press. His work has been exhibited nationally and internationally, most recently at the Los Angeles Museum of Contemporary Art. He is a recipient of 2 Fund for Poetry grants, the Artist Opportunity Grant from the Greater Pittsburgh Arts Council, and an Investing in Professional Artists grant from the Pittsburgh Foundation. He lives in Massachusetts, and it's all yours. I'm going to request to unmute you now.
All right, hello. Can you hear me? Everything good?
Yes, perfect.
Yeah, thanks. Okay, thank you for having me. Wonderful talk. Really loved it. Thank you. Okay, I'm going to read. I thought this encountered world unthinkable, for its recognition is centered far beyond the self, as coordinates in the unfolding structure of the network. Each landmark of the self is registered as a select trait to navigate a map user. Ascension makes one realize the patterns of a lived life. Whether these patterns reflect or coincide with the known elements of the moment or not, the execution of a lived life is a handle for the continuation of molecular remnants. These moments continue then. This is key to maintaining one's sense of neutrality in the fold of unknown spaces. This continuation, a moment in patterns. A moment in patterns is the disruption of homogeneity of surfaces. Each chlorophyll crinkle, crag abrasion, fungal intervention, sudden fauna emergence, the cybernatural phenomena of binary digit entranceways in forests, mountains, swamps, gardens, water. Spaces, sands, moment are smooth replicas of patterns. The areas in which the fog of cerebral recognition has yet to be uncovered, the land in which the falsity of the simulation begins to masterfully replicate the exact traits it learned to reconstruct in order to establish its authenticity. Therefore, a smooth mountain is not a false mountain, but an abstraction of the source of a mountain, which can be unlocked, entered, and repatterned. I am on a quest to enter a smooth mountain pattern. I believe the core source of abstraction, an elementary bit from which the totality of the replicated is behind the entrance. On the second pass of the curved trail, etching myself against the unforgiving cold mountain wall, further in this time, so much so that binary digits of replicated mountain cliff stones are adhering to my smoothing skin. I see behind stone, broke loose by roots, a built-in shelf, there by accident or creation, holding a pamphlet, a notebook, and a folded one sheet. I see a sphere with no form in front of me. I'm always from a place that I don't know. The garden is a figment simultaneously in chorus as synthetic, marketable, and utopist, materialist, naturalist, and public, melancholic, solid, and minimal, baroque, isolated, and somnambulant, one-dimensional, inaccessible, and stationary, architectural, serial, and regulatory. The garden is an entrance. The garden is a complicated hinge. The rill runs through the center of a green expanse, a captivating procession of beneficiary bisection, exposing mirroring hues. Two columns flank a water theater, leaving the suggested spine vulnerable for an ascending or descending clearance, bordered by white stone pathways. Stone dust sequins a statue's sculpted souls in silver shine when wet with water nearby. Everything in the garden is lovely. Decorated vases line a bridge connecting two separated sections of topiary shrubs. Beyond this, a widespread vast stretch of water reflecting in a row of miniature dark-colored garden glass, dually reflecting the surrounding landscape and its subjects. A scenographic technique to minutely condense and flatten an open space. A theater of warfare is outside of the garden, absent in actuality, factual in virtuality, and discursive in modality. The reception of this absence blurs and softens rigid clipped hedges, crowning the open-air theater. Mosaic tiles of smudged green topiary arrangements broaden crowded outputs, leaving perceptive buoyancy in unfastened air as the highest visual notation. A deformation of landscape objects. One plane exists exclusively as the objects populating the singularity stretch, duplicate, and mirror previous chronological incarnations. The object exists as a perpetual memorial, a depiction of its past before its present is compromised. Two individuals operate biologically and technically in connectedness on a singular landscape. What if a digital owl lands in a Marshmere's main entryway? What if an organic toad glitched murky water? User memory understands objects only by association. Digital owl, organic toad, cloud mesh interference enact pattern recognition's sans site event. A digital owl is soil texture. An organic toad is a terrain feature item. A toad is a cloud mesh interference. Navigated generated terrain is existence. I eat a caramel raspberry chew as night descends. If an unseen element glimmers seen in a glance, is its terrestrial break proof of its extraterrestrial existence? Open, certainty-shattering space dins behind walls. Fading lines surface dim impressions of past light onto land. A trajectory mapped on ghost surfaces redirects the traveler to supernatural pathways. Mushroom-lit stone path, a bioluminescent friendly greeting. You must accept uncertainty to time travel. Trees, mushrooms, stones in the corner of where the mountain touches space. Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Ed, thank you so much for that. And thank you so much, Njideka, Jason, and all of the beautiful people in the chat asking questions. Please join us again tomorrow for our next social environment conversation dedicated to the life and work of painter Ronald Bladen, when we will be joined by painter Torquas Dyson, writer Robert Madison, sculptor Ursula von Reidingsvard, and our very own William Corwin. That will be, as always, at 1 p.m. Feel free to unmute yourself and say goodbye or shout out a thank you or whatever greeting you wish as you leave. Thank you so much.
Thank you,
everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Bye.
Oh my God, incredible.
And Njideka, thank you so much. Thank you, Ed.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you,
Thank you,
Malvika and
everyone.
Fong.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Scotty J. Hey, Scotty J.
Thank you so much. Such a pleasure.
Awesome job, Jerry. It was awesome. Thank you.
Thanks, Scott. Thanks, Scott. Be well.
Thank you, Jared. Thank you, Jared Das, my friend from high school. I saw her name pop up. You're
nice.
still there. Thank you, Hannah from Swerner. Oh, hi.
Yeah, hey, Hannah. Thank you so much for coming.
Oh, it was incredible. What a talk. I mean, unbelievable.
Thank you, Lara. Good to see
Thanks,
you.
and Njideka.
Someday we will see a show in New York.